March 4th, 1865. Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural dawned with rain and hail in Washington, D.C. The capital was less a city than a collection of villages, and its unpaved streets were caked in mud 10 inches deep. Still, thousands trudged to the Capitol to witness the president's inaugural address. Lincoln's new vice president, Tennessee Democrat Andrew Johnson, was sworn in first in front of Congress. His speech that day would make an impression that would uncannily reflect his unexpected presidency just 6 weeks later.
Johnson drank several glasses of whiskey before he went to be inaugurated. So he gives a speech in which he's slurring his words and losing his way. It's humiliating.
He began to give a drunken harangue about how he was a plebeian, a man of the common people. He began to refer to members of the cabinet there, and he couldn't really remember their name. He even had to be pulled down by his coattails by another member of the cabinet. This is not promising material.
As the only Southern senator to remain in the Union during the Civil War, Johnson was chosen as vice president to forge a national unity ticket with Lincoln. But the strategy backfired when John Wilkes Booth fired that shot in Ford's Theater. Andrew Johnson was suddenly the leader of a country still divided by war and a government divided by party.
Andrew Johnson was essentially at the head of a Republican administration, but he wasn't a Republican, he was a Democrat.
So here you've got a president who has been elected by one party, belongs to another, with a Congress very much in the opposite party from himself. He's going to have problems, deep problems.
Andrew Johnson was no stranger to struggle. The dirt poor boy from Tennessee had taught himself to read and write and worked his way up from an indentured servant to a backwoods tailor to U.S. Senator to the 17th President of the United States. But the uncompromising attitude he developed along the way proved ill-suited for the highest office in the country.
He had no tact. He was a frontier brawler. That's what had got him to where he was. People who become president of the United States tend to think it's because I have these traits and I've been doing these sorts of things my whole life. So they're not going to change their ways.
Following Abraham Lincoln would have been a virtually impossible act for any president. Lincoln was outsized in terms of his emotions, his kindness, his affability, his good nature, and his political savvy, which was very, very great. So Johnson did have a problem.
The nation was desperate for a strong leader who could bring back the United to the United States. It would be a near impossible task. 15% of the nation had taken up arms against each other. More than 600,000 soldiers had died. The war left the Southern economy in ruins, and more than half of its towns were occupied by Union troops.
Andrew Johnson wanted to bring the states of the South back into full-fledged membership of the Union as rapidly as possible. He didn't want them to pay any particular price. So Johnson was on a different track from Congress, and so it was ripe for battle, and there was battle.
Johnson grabbed the reins of power quickly and set his plans in motion while Congress wasn't in session.
The sessions were very short. Members came in for a relatively brief term, 5 months, met from December to May. They adjourned before D.C. got hot.
So Johnson is in control of what the first months of Reconstruction are going to be like. And what he does is he says that when the former Confederates ask for pardons and are pardoned by me, then they can come back into the Union.
Andrew Johnson was prepared to leave a lot of autonomy to the southern states. He believed that they should pretty much reconstruct themselves.
Johnson issued orders for the seceded states to hold elections and announced 2 simple conditions for the southern states to be readmitted to the Union and Congress.
Southern states must agree that secession had been illegal, null and void, and they must essentially accept the 13th Amendment. They must agree that slavery was over, and over for good. Those were the conditions that were set. But the North had wanted something more than that.
The radical Republicans in Congress wanted really to stick it to the South. And they did believe, as a matter of political philosophy, that African Americans in the South should achieve something much closer to equal rights than they had.
The passage of the 13th Amendment at the end of 1865 had freed more than 4 million slaves. In open defiance, the Southern state legislatures responded by enacting what were called the Black Codes.
Any black out there without a job can immediately be put to any kind of labor you want. Any black kid can be taken away from his family and can be apprenticed. And they can be sold for up to a year of their labor. What does that sound like? Does it sound like slavery to you?
The Republican-dominated Congress was furious, seeing these state laws as a ploy to keep the old slavery system in effect. A full-scale political war erupted between Johnson and Congress, who thought the president was letting the South off easy.
Johnson says this is basically a continuation of the war powers. I can do what I want to do. And Congress says, no, you can't.
There was no longer a war, so Congress did not need to defer to him because there was no longer an emergency situation. And so it did everything it could and to actually take back power and to make Congress the center of policymaking.
When Johnson vetoes the Civil Rights Act, there is this sudden realization that this man can't be trusted. They viewed Johnson as going beyond Lincoln's policies.
For only the 8th time in the nation's 90-year history, Congress overrode the president's veto. The Civil Rights Bill passed. Over the next 3 years, Johnson issued 21 vetoes, more than George Washington, James Madison, Andrew Jackson, and Abraham Lincoln combined. Congress overrode 71% of them, the highest for any president.
Johnson did not like to negotiate. He did not like to consult. He just wanted to act. And so Johnson was not an effective president, and the Republicans in Congress got their way.
The battle next moved into the 1866 congressional elections. Johnson set a precedent by becoming the first president to actively campaign against the opposing political party. He went on a whistle-stop tour he called the Swing Around the Circle.
Andrew Johnson went from Washington up to New York and then across the Northwest all the way to Chicago, advocating his policy of Reconstruction and attacking radical Republicans at every train stop. So it proved to be a disaster. It was the most counterproductive exercise in presidential speech-making in American history. Republicans won the congressional elections of 1866 overwhelmingly.
A combination of radical Republicans and moderate Republicans hold a 2/3 majority in Congress so that any veto that Johnson might have applied to their measures they could overturn because they had enough power.
A tug of war between the two branches quickly ensued.
They pass a Reconstruction Act that reverses much of what he had done. And then they come up with the Tenure of Office Act, which doesn't allow Johnson to fire one of his cabinet members without the Senate reviewing it.
Andrew Johnson wanted quite naturally to be able to fire the people who worked for him. And Congress said, no, you can't.
Johnson was not going to give up any of his executive authority. Defying the Republican Congress, he fired Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, a Republican and a Lincoln holdover.
Congress immediately sees this as the first step to use military force to take over the War Department so that you can control the Army and you can use it for goodness knows what kind of purposes.
It's not terribly surprising that he would become the first president to be impeached. The level of distrust and hatred was extreme during this presidency.
On February 24th, 1868, Congress, for the first time, impeached a sitting president on 11 counts of high crimes and misdemeanors. Johnson's fate would be decided in a trial by the Senate 3.5 months later.
No one knows for sure how the vote is going to go. It's very narrow. A few senators, there's a feeling that they may go one way or they may go the other. It's not clear. Imagine a day where you've got one of the senators deathly ill being carried in on a chair to vote.
It would take a 2/3 vote in the Senate to convict. At the time, that meant 36 votes, and there were 45 Republicans in the Senate.
The vote was 35 votes to convict, 19 to acquit. Johnson got off by 1 vote.
They thought that it would probably permanently weaken the presidency, that it would tip the balance too far in the direction of Congress.
But Johnson's victory was a hollow one. He had no power, and he had damaged the office of the president.
Throughout the entire Johnson administration, it's fundamentally a struggle, because it's about Reconstruction, of who has power, the president or Congress. And coming out of this, it's very clear that Congress is the winner in this struggle.
December 31st, 1899, the eve of a new century. In San Francisco, extra police were stationed on the streets to ward off an expected wave of public kissing. New York celebrated with a thrilling novelty: colored electric lights. America was modernizing. New inventions. Cars, radios, movies were transforming the nation. And Theodore Roosevelt would prove to be the right man for the right time. He would change the role of president from administrator to visionary leader.
In so many respects, Theodore Roosevelt is the first modern president. The debate we're having now over executive power is one that he would recognize, because he ignited it a century ago.
Theodore Roosevelt, as a boy, was frail, asthmatic. Theodore Roosevelt's father said to him as a young boy, "Theodore, you have the mind, but you do not have the body. And without the body, the mind cannot go as far as it should."
So he built himself up. He learned to box, went out west, worked on ranches, built his body, and he made himself do so many things that would produce this extraordinary adult.
He first earned himself recognition as New York City's police commissioner, and eventually became a national hero in the Spanish-American War. And as the Republican governor of New York, he became well known for his progressive reforms.
He's trying to control kids working around heavy machinery, and he's sending inspectors into factories. And this is really upsetting the pro-business wing of the Republican Party. And they're sitting around thinking, how do we get rid of him? How do we send him someplace where no one will ever hear from him again? So what do? We'll make him vice president of the United States.
McKinley's first vice president, Garrett Hobart, died in office, and so McKinley chose Theodore Roosevelt. His friend Mark Hanna shook his head and said, "Don't you realize there's only one life between you and that cowboy?"
September 1901. 6 months after his second inauguration, McKinley was assassinated. Theodore Roosevelt, at 42 years old, became the youngest president that would ever hold the office. The man Republicans were trying to rid themselves of was now in charge, and he immediately confronted an industrial revolution that had its victors and victims.
For the first time in American politics, you get a huge concentration of private power in the form of large corporations. The giant trusts.
The trusts, through their control of transportation and production of basic needs, had a stranglehold on prices. Food costs were incredibly high. The average salary was $750 per year. It took nearly half of that just to feed an average family of 5.
When Roosevelt becomes president in 1901, there was no income tax, there was very little regulation. Business had grown tremendously over the past 40 years, and most presidents were willing to just let it happen. Teddy Roosevelt was not. Teddy Roosevelt wanted to create a society that was more balanced, and he saw the office of the presidency at the center of that struggle.
Theodore Roosevelt believed that unless presidents acted to mitigate against some of the excesses of the Industrial Revolution, the alternative would be social chaos and fundamental revolution.
Roosevelt decided to take on the captains of industry. The most, perhaps notorious one, was J.P. Morgan, the great financier. And Roosevelt had not been in office 6 months before he initiated an antitrust lawsuit against Northern Securities, a railroad combination.
In 1900, 90% of the country's cargo traveled by train. America was utterly dependent on that 200,000-mile web of steel. And Northern Securities controlled every rail line between Chicago and the Northwest.
It decided whether towns would live or die. It was really the lifeblood of American commercial society. One of the problems is they discriminated against small shippers and gave advantages to large shippers. So he proposed something called the Hepburn Act, which would prohibit the railroads from discriminating against small shippers.
Roosevelt's point was not really to break up all of the trusts. It was to remind the big capitalists, people like Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, John Rockefeller, that in a democracy, the people rule, which meant that Congress and the president have the last say. This is not a country of, by, and for capitalism.
Morgan fought him all the way to the Supreme Court, where Roosevelt won. A precedent was set, allowing the president to have an expansive view of the office.
He explicitly said that he looked at the Constitution and does it say, can I not do it? And if it didn't say he couldn't, then he figured he could.
In Congress, there's many legislators that don't agree with Roosevelt at all about his vision for America. They wanted to continue to do business as business had been done in the past.
Roosevelt inherited the office. He wasn't elected. He had Democrats he had to deal with. His own Republican Party was divided. You have to understand that Roosevelt had no mandate, but he manufactured one. He had a vision of the presidency. He wanted to use it as a bully pulpit to try to change America.
Whether it was through fiery speeches or the press, Roosevelt's goal was to build a legislative agenda by gaining the support of the people.
Theodore Roosevelt comes into office determined to create a modern presidency. He was not going to relate to the American people through these layers of constitutional government, the state legislature, the Congress, the political parties. He wanted to build a direct relationship.
He took his case to the public to try to convince Congress, and presidents didn't do that before. They didn't go out and speak on behalf of policy. Now it's very common.
He had an avenue to publicity that nobody else had. TR really pioneers this idea of a celebrity president.
Americans didn't just have a growing fascination with their president, they were captivated by many new sensations sweeping the nation. Annual baseball attendance went from 1 million to 7 million. People were buying 10 million bicycles a year, and they fell in love with Italian opera singer Enrico Caruso, making him the first artist to sell 1 million copies of a single sound recording. The country's rapid changes were frequently front-page news, and Roosevelt knew it would be to his political benefit if he were associated with them.
He was the president who embraced the gadgets. He was the first president to ride in a car. He was the first president to fly in an airplane.
The key is that Roosevelt was photographed doing all these things, which kept him in the public eye, and in doing so, he increased the visibility of the office of the presidency.
He gave interviews to the press while being shaved. He met with the French ambassador while hiking, and he never stopped speaking.
I am leaving because somebody must leave, or else the fight would not be made at all.
He kept a huge personal staff to take down his thoughts. 4 typists, 6 stenographers, 6 messengers, and several clerks. Roosevelt also turned his personal life into a photo op.
Theodore Roosevelt knew that it was very attractive to voters. He was a young, virile guy with this large family with kids running all around the White House. And so Theodore Roosevelt at times would bring the kids into the limelight.
Every day at 4 p.m., Roosevelt had Children's Hour, reading or playing with his 6 children, including games of hide-and-go-seek in the White House.
He invented the modern presidential family. There's a direct line from TR's family to John F. Kennedy's family. Each were popularized. Each became part of our extended family through the media of their day.
To make room for his large family and his heavy workload, Roosevelt initiated the most extensive renovation in White House history. He added a new West Wing to relocate and expand executive office space. The modern Oval Office would eventually be carved out of the space in 1934 by his cousin, Franklin Roosevelt. TR also officially renamed the mansion.
Until his presidency, the place where the president lived was known as the Executive Mansion. Well, Theodore Roosevelt decided, well, how can people establish a direct relationship with an executive mansion? So he changes the name of the president's residence to the White House so that it began to symbolize the people's house.
But Roosevelt's remodeling of the presidency went much deeper than renaming the mansion and knocking out walls. He was remaking the office to suit his own unique personality.
Theodore Roosevelt needed to be at center stage, as his daughter said. To understand my father, you need to realize that he must be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral.
He's the first president to really extensively use unilateral presidential power to get things done. That is, to act without having to have Congress pass legislation.
Theodore Roosevelt had virtually no patience with the legislative process. Get it done yesterday, get it done before yesterday. And so he created ways of getting things done. Executive orders. I'll just sign an order. Boom, it's done.
1933. On March 4th, Franklin Delano Roosevelt arrived at the Capitol to take the oath of office and become the 32nd President of the United States. Unable to walk independently after a 13-year battle with polio, Roosevelt wore leg braces under his pants, but was still able to take the few short but sturdy steps to the podium.
It had been raining for the week before the inauguration in Washington, D.C., and as he's coming to take the oath of office, the sun literally did come out.
Before a crowd of 100,000 at the Capitol and tens of millions on the radio, FDR recited the 35-word oath by heart and then gave one of the most memorable speeches ever delivered by a president.
After years of economic spiral and something close to despair, when millions of Americans had basically abandoned hope about the future, this man came out of nowhere and in the course of a speech, one speech, began to address the psychological needs of the country.
So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
A critical aspect of any president is to engender confidence. It was critical that the American people could hear him say, hey, there are folks here in Washington who are going to take charge.
FDR was following through on his mandate from the 1932 election, promising a new deal for the American people. He had carried 42 states and 57% of the popular vote. In Congress, Republicans lost over 100 seats to the Democrats, the biggest congressional shift in nearly 40 years, giving Roosevelt a solid majority to work with in both the House and the Senate. But he was vague on how he was going to use it.
Franklin Roosevelt came into office with a great deal of hope. No one knew precisely what Roosevelt would do.
Roosevelt believed in action for the sake of action. Even if it's wrong, it's okay. The humorist Will Rogers said, you know, if he'd burned down the Capitol or the White House, we would have said, good, at least he got a fire started anyhow. That's how cold and bad it felt in 1932.
The first thing he did was declare a bank holiday, basically to shut down the banks all over the country. There was serious question whether this was constitutional, and Americans were alarmed enough that they were willing to go along with it. Then the next thing he did was to figure out a way of preserving the banking system more or less as it existed.
10,000 banks had failed since 1929. With a Congress solidly behind him, Roosevelt pushed through the Emergency Banking Relief Act, which reorganized the banking system and, most importantly, federally guaranteed deposits for the first time.
The next morning, when the banks started to open, lines again began to form outside the banks. But now people lined up to put their money in banks. And within a space of 2 weeks, the banking crisis was resolved.
Roosevelt also realized he needed something that would provide comfort to Americans. So he signed a bill re-legalizing certain alcohol sales, saying, I think this would be a good time for a beer. On April 7th, Thousands lined up outside taverns and distilleries to enjoy their first legal drink in 14 years.
Roosevelt had that cheer as a leader, and that was important to the voter, especially in the Depression.
The first 100 days is probably the most storied period of presidential success in Congress in all of American history. In fact, he got his brain trust together, and they hastily wrote legislation, and he sent it to Congress, boom, 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 and they passed it. Major piece of legislation after major piece of legislation.
The Agricultural Adjustment Act, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Civil Works Administration, the Public Works Administration, the Tennessee Valley Authority. Roosevelt displayed a passion and a commitment to finding solutions for every aspect of the Depression.
Roosevelt revealed the same qualities in dealing with the Depression that he had once used in trying to deal with polio. A sense of determination, an unbounded optimism, a willingness to experiment with different ideas. And this really becomes the hallmark of his style of government.
But above all, what he did was he established, as Andrew Jackson had 100 years earlier, as Lincoln had at the time of Fort Sumter, great leaders don't manage a crisis. They frankly use the crisis to establish an emotional bond with the American people.
Roosevelt was deeply concerned that he be seen as a pillar of strength for the country, so he carefully crafted his image for the public eye.
Anybody who met him was shocked when they saw him in a wheelchair because there were only 2 pictures that show him in the wheelchair that he used every day, and neither of those were printed while he was alive.
FDR soon realized his real power lay in being heard, not seen. While Harding in 1922 was the first president to be heard on the radio, and Coolidge a year later the first to make regular radio speeches, Roosevelt mastered the medium through radio addresses every week, his Fireside Chats.
My friends, you and I agree that security is our greatest need, the chance to work, the opportunity of making a reasonable profit in our business.
There's this immediate magnetism, and the White House is just flooded with letters. Suddenly they have to hire dozens of people to handle this immense volume of mail that comes in. There's something about the radio that makes people feel more connected and want to reach out and respond.
FDR's approach was an enormous success. Though the country was still in a depression, still struggling with double-digit unemployment, the American people were confident in their president. In the 1936 election, they gave Roosevelt the biggest landslide victory in presidential history, 46 of 48 states. FDR's confidence swelled.